There was news this morning of a soldier being killed in Belfast, and the IRA say they planted the bomb in which somebody was killed 20 minutes before the counting began in Belfast. We have a report on that event, so let's have that now from our correspondent Lance Price.
The bomb attached to a lamppost exploded as a 7-man joint army-police patrol was passing. The dead soldier, a private in the Light Infantry Regiment, was killed instantly. A second soldier was treated in hospital for shock. The explosion blew the dead man across the road and smashed windows in nearby houses. And it followed an earlier unsuccessful attempt to kill a policeman in South Belfast by putting a bomb under his car. The fatal explosion happened 20 minutes before counting began in Northern Ireland, as local children were on their way to school. One boy, whose route would have taken him past the exact spot, said one of the 2 policemen in the patrol shouted a warning just before the bomb went off.
I was coming down a road there and about 8:30, and I was standing just after a red door, and the Brit was kneeling down beside a lamppost, and someone, a peeler says to the Brit, watch out, no, beside the lamppost, and a couple of seconds later a bomb went off. And he was landing on the road, and our Brit was blew over a wall.
The police believe it was a booby-trap bomb detonated from somewhere nearby, although they can't say exactly where. And it follows a warning last night from the RUC for extra vigilance from the public on counting day.
Well, that's why I asked.
Sir Robin Day is back with us, having failed to elicit from Mrs. Thatcher the date of the next general election, except that she preferred June. So let's go over to Sir Robin. Robin.
Well, that's an extremely important thing to have elicited, if I may say so. I've now got, it's Norman St. John Stevens, Austin Mitchell, and Ken Livingstone. Ken Livingstone was not a candidate in this election, but he's a man whose views are always sought by us sensational-seeking media. Now, first of all, Norman, what do you think of what the Prime Minister had to say in her little chat with me at number 10?
Well, I think you elicited from her something of much more importance than a hypothetical date for an election. And I think that was the most important interview that has taken place since the election itself, because she was giving very clear notice that she was going to continue along the lines of moderate policies. She was not going to have a right-wing cabinet. She was going to have a cabinet with different spectrums of views there. And she used that word, which was very significant. She talked about trust, power being a trust. Well, that's a very fundamental Tory notion.
Was it a Disraeli notion, as she suggested it was? I can't recall it.
Well, it goes right back beyond Disraeli. It goes back to Bolingbroke and right to the very foundations of the Tory party.
Yes.
Power, a trust; property, a trust; talent, a trust. And so you see there that she is, in fact, broadening out from the narrow base which people want to assign her to.
And do you think her new cabinet, which she's going to form this weekend, will be sufficiently broad-based to include some of the people who have fallen by the wayside?
I don't think I know about falling by the wayside, particularly at this moment, having been elected so triumphantly.
Yes, quite.
For Chelmsford.
You're going to be the first person, I understand, to sue a computer for libel, is this right?
I would, yes, and I can sue both the ITN and the BBC and thus be
That's right, as F.E.
EQ.
Smith said, the damages will be enormous. Austin Mitchell, what do you think about this question of proportional representation? Because you signed that letter to the Times yesterday morning, didn't you?
Well, I'm not sure what Norman's views are as one of the offcuts from the joint. I think it's going to make it rather more difficult to sell proportional representation to the Labour Party at the present moment. I look at it this way. Proportional representation is right in itself, because it seems to me a fair system that the parties in Parliament should represent the wishes of the electorate about parties. I think it'll be a setback for proportional representation because both major parties now have an even more naked vested interest in opposing it, while the Alliance, many of whom I hasten to add were very late converts to proportional representation. In fact, Bill Rogers had to borrow my pamphlet to go and speak at Cambridge about it. They've also got a naked self-interest.
You saw Peter Snow. Let me chip in there, because you saw Peter Snow's projection, I don't know whether you think it was accurate, of what would have happened, so our computer thinks, if we'd had some PR system now. And you got a system which you would have to have a hung parliament with a Labour government.
But
what policies would that Labour government be?
That wouldn't have happened.
Oh.
In proportional representation, people have to evaluate the parties as instruments of government. It's not kind of dustbin of impractical dreams like the Alliance are, because they've been a great public relations bubble which is now pricked. People would have to evaluate them as, do I really want this party to be involved in running the country? Has it any contribution to make? And on that basis, it would still be a straight choice between Labour and Conservative, and the alliance would be reduced, as the Free Democrats are in West Germany, to a comparatively small proportion, because they're a protest vote. They're a bucket to spit in, and nothing more or less than that. And the protest at the moment is strong because people are uneasy about both major parties.
Just so that people understand your point of view, Austin Mitchell, as a Labour MP, nonetheless you think that it is unfair that your party should have 200 seats in the House of Commons, whereas the Alliance has 24 seats for almost the same size of popular vote.
I think both major parties have got an unfair representation in the House of Commons. I think PR will improve matters and make the House of Commons more acceptable to the public, but it won't necessarily strengthen the alliance all that much.
Ken Livingstone? Sorry, I'm just hearing some... Well, let's have the PR computer forecast. There it is, and Peter Snow was talking about it a moment or two ago. That is what our computer says that PR would have meant in this election, but Austin Mitchell says that's rubbish.
Well, people would have voted differently.
Yes.
If we're faced with a real choice between parties, and that choice was going to be carried through into Parliament, they'd have had a very different view of the alliance.
Let's leave that just for one moment, because I want to ask another point with Ken Livingstone, if we've got a moment. What's going to happen in the Labour Party, Ken Livingstone, and what do you think is going to happen in the Labour Party?
I think that there'll be a re-evaluation of policy, and that will be more important than the question of who leads or what combination of forces lead the party. Because I think we lost this election not because of any of the particular problems that hit us during the campaign. We lost it because we didn't convince the people of this country that we have policies which can resolve the economic crisis. Had we been able to do that, all the other setbacks we experienced, I think, would not have been relevant. And that's our failure. And I think the Labour Party has fudged. We spoke an awful lot about borrowing money, and I don't think ordinary people in this country think you can borrow your way out of this sort of crisis. I think the Labour Party, if it's ever to win government, has got to tackle the wealth that is already there, mainly based in the City of London, currently going abroad to be invested everywhere else on the face of the planet, but not rebuilding our own industry and not rebuilding our own welfare state.
Do you think people like you contributed to Labour's defeat?
Well, not on the basis of the results in London. Although we've had some very bad results in the South East, in London we held many seats which on the national scene we most probably would have been expected to lose.
Austin Mitchell, what do you think is going to happen and ought to happen in the Labour Party?
Well,
change of leader?
I don't agree with Ken's proposition. I think his is one of the great if-onlys, and he says if only we'd pushed the policy, things would have been different. My view is really you don't concoct a policy by a set of conference resolutions. You see what the problem is, what's got to be done, and you set out certain broad general themes. You don't encumber yourself with a whole ragbag of policies covering the whole spectrum. And that's the approach we shall adopt in future.
Do you want a new leader?
On the leadership, well, I mean, anything that weakens the Labour Party weakens the nation, as I see it. And in this election, it was crucial that we present an impression of competence and efficiency that we showed we were the party that could take care of these problems. It's no use now arguing about the leader. In a sense, it's too late. It's too late for the kind of...
It's not too late for the next election.
Well, if there was going to be a change, it should have been taken place in the way it changed in Australia with Hayden and Hawke before the election.
Do you want a new leader now?
Michael Foot wasn't our biggest asset in the election, but to change now is too late. What we want is an efficient machinery.
Poor old Michael got to go on until 1988.
It's too late now to change immediately. The press will whip up all the speculations, but it's an irrelevant question now. The damage is done. Let's go on and decide this thing in calm and deliberation.
But why is it an irrelevant question? As an old TV interviewer, you should know better than that.
Because if there was to be a change in the leadership, it should have been before the election to give us a broader popular appeal. It was crucial that we win this election because the country is going downhill very rapidly, and anything that weakens the Labour Party accelerates that process of decline. It's too late now. You only want to stir it as an issue to give popular appeal to the media and to stir divisions within the party. It's too late. Let's leave it and come to it in a calmer atmosphere.
I want to stir things.
Well, yes.
I'm just trying to help the people of this country understand what you mean. Who do you think should be the next leader of the Labour
Robin,
Party?
you make a living out of stirring things. You make a living out of focusing attention on the Labour Party's weaknesses.
Norman, your final word from
when
you.
the real problems of this country are the mess the government's made of things, and that should have been the main issue at this election.
Oh, it was indeed, yes.
Well, what I think is important is that the Tory party should now take this opportunity, led by Mrs. Thatcher, to reunite all the wings of the party. It would require great restraint and statesmanship on her part, but I think in that interview with you, she gave every indication that that is the course she intends to follow. I've no personal axe to grind, I've no personal ambitions in this direction, but I would like to see the sort of Toryism that I represent fully represented in the Cabinet.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. David?
Eric Varley, who said on this programme that he didn't propose to stand for the leadership of the Labour Party if it became vacant, holds on to his seat in Chesterfield with his majority down a certain amount. And somebody else who at one point was rumoured to be thinking of standing as an alternative Tory leader against Mrs Thatcher at the peak of her unpopularity, though he never said that that's what he was planning to do. Geoffrey Rippon has just held his seat in Hexham, a safe Conservative seat, and here's the result there. His majority is up a bit, and Labour and Libs swap places in terms of both vote and place on the poll. Geoffrey Rippon, who we may be able to talk to in just a moment. It's quite interesting, incidentally, with all this talk about proportional representation, that proportional representation was proposed by a Speakers' Conference in 1917, was rejected in the House of Commons by only 7 votes. And that, again, not proportional representation exactly, but a reform of the voting system was proposed by the minority government in 1930, passed by the Commons, rejected by the Lords. That was a system for an alternative vote, which was a way of allowing people to choose, they thought, more accurately the kind of person they wanted to represent them in one particular constituency. So there's nothing new in the ideas, though there'll be no doubt much discussed. Now, Peter.
Well, you have just joined us. The Conservatives are heading for a majority, absolutely neck and neck with that Labour landslide of 1945, round 146 seats. Here is the map of the country, building up with 586 results in out of the 650. A few more still to come, about 70 still to come. There they are, look at that map turning blue, and look at the dense section of blue all over the rural areas of southern England there, and the Labour Party hitting the urban areas, but absolutely only 2 seats, only 2 seats for Labour outside London in the south of England. Liberal SDP Alliance on 17, down 11. And just a quick look at the Tory gains on their own. There they are, 50 of them altogether, 41 from Labour and 9 from the Liberal SDP Alliance. David.
Now I think we go to Truro for David Penhaligon's declaration.
Yes.
Well, they're down
Dave
there.
Dar, a Cornish good day from Truro in Cornwall, where the declaration is about to be made any moment. The returning officer is the High Sheriff for Cornwall, Miss Elizabeth Johnston. David Penhaligon is the Liberal MP who stood in this constituency since 1974. Philip Bedell is the Conservative. He's standing for the first time. He's a chartered surveyor. Janet Beecroft is also standing for the first time as the Labour candidate. They're all local candidates. They're gathering on the stage now, and the declaration is expected at any moment. A slight pause here for a moment while we wait for the declaration.
Parliamentary election, Truro constituency. The date of the poll, 9th of June, 1983. I, the undersigned, being the returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Beecroft, Janet Mary.
Labour.
2479. Bardell, Philip Durham.
Conservative.
20799. Penhaligon, David Charles.
Liberal.
31279. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency. David Charles Penhaligon.
So David Penhaligon for the Liberals has been returned for Truro with an increased majority.
Signed, Elizabeth Johnston, Returning Officer, the 10th of June, 1983.
The Labour candidate, Mrs. Beecroft, has in fact lost her deposit, and David Penhaligon is about to make his speech.
It is, of course, my immense pleasure to be able to come and give the general vote of thanks to Madam High Sheriff, who not only has graced this particular occasion, but provided everybody with some very welcome refreshments during the night and during the day. The returning officer, Mr. Dorey, his staff, Mr. Butson in particular, the police, the clerks, polling day staff. You've done an excellent and efficient job, and I'm sure on behalf of all the candidates, I can thank you, and I have never seen it done any better, and for that I thank you. Most of all, of course, I must thank my workers who really can share this result with me. It's the result of years of effort. My agent, Malcolm Brown, my wife, and all those that have made such a massive contribution through delivering leaflets and canvassing and all the things which makes up an election campaign. One can only reflect that one cannot deny the Prime Minister an enormous triumph at this poll. She has a majority of 140. I just hope the irony of the situation does not escape her. And that is that it is actually achieved on less votes than the majority of 40 or 50 was obtained in the last Parliament. I cannot think of another so-called democracy in the Western world that would allow a distortion the like of which this election is to pass without immediately passing reforms through the House of Commons to do something about it. Is it an obscene distortion? It is an obscene distortion of the public view, and we have a sham of a parliament that does not represent the people or the views they express. As far as I'm personally concerned in this constituency, although on the whole the results of the alliance have been less than we hoped for, I must admit the majority here surpasses my wildest dreams. And I thank the good people in this constituency for that. They really have, for now, a sustained period to me, been very kind indeed. I thank them all very much indeed.
As Returning Officer of the Inverness, Nairn and Lochaber constituency, I hereby give notice that the total number of votes polled for each candidate in the election was as follows. Russell Johnston, Liberal SDP Alliance, 20,671. David John McLean, the Conservative Party candidate, 13,373. Duncan Macmillan, the Labour Party candidate, 6,448. Hamish William Vernal, Scottish National Party, 4,395. And I declare that Russell Johnston has been duly elected to serve in Parliament as a member for the said constituency. The percentage poll was 69.95.
Well, the Scottish Nationalists vote right down there, the Labour vote right down, and all the benefit going to Russell Johnston, whose majority is 7,000 or so, a massive increase, 17% increase in the Liberal vote. And now to Hexham, and there he is, Geoffrey Rippon, and he's with Nick Clark.
Geoffrey Rippon, congratulations on your result. Your share of the poll is up. Now, in the past, you've been quite a stern critic of Mrs. Thatcher's economic policies. How do you feel now about seeing her in power for another 4 or 5 years with a very much increased majority?
Well, I'm absolutely delighted because I'm firmly behind her defence policy and her European policy, both of which have been important issues in this election. And as for economic policy, such criticisms as I offered in the first 2 years have been fully met now. So I'm very confident that we will, in the next Parliament, build on the very real achievements of the Conservative government.
Now, you did say a couple of years ago, we cannot exaggerate not merely the economic and financial, but also the social costs of unemployment at present levels. Now, it's considerably worse now than it was then. How can you be so happy about the economic policies that Mrs. Thatcher's applying?
Well, I think Mrs. Thatcher would say the same thing. We can't be happy. They are unacceptable levels. But I remember at the last election, I said if you don't cure inflation, the unemployment is inevitable. Now we have brought the inflation down, largely by following a number of what I would call good monetarist instead of bad monetarist policies. So now I think we are poised for a great advance. But no one can deny the social consequences of unemployment or the economic ones. But I'm very glad, for example, that we are now spending rather more money on public capital investment. We've got to cut public expenditure in many ways, but not capital investment.
Has Mrs. Thatcher moved towards you, or have you moved towards Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, I'd like to think a bit of both. A consensus, if one may use that word.
How is it, do you think, that she's managed to create this tremendous popularity when 2 years ago things were looking very bleak for her, at the time when you and so many other Wets were unhappy with what she was doing?
What I think she has done is changed attitudes. She has given Britain a new self-confidence and a new understanding of the realities, and I think that is what has done it. And I must say she's been a magnificent leader in regard to the Falklands, and I don't know that anyone else could have seen us through that as well.
Geoffrey Rippon, thank you very much indeed. And we're going now to Penrith, I think.
And the result in Penrith imminent now. Mr. Dennis Brown, the returning officer.
Will you open the doors, please?
He's saying that because the heating's been left on all night in this building for some reason, and everybody's been sweltering here during this long count. And now the party supporters are moving up to the rostrum. Mr. Whitelaw, as you might expect, looking reasonably relaxed. Incidentally, if you're puzzled by the fact that Willie Whitelaw is wearing a yellow rosette, as opposed to all the blue ones we've seen in the past few hours, it's because yellow is the Tory colour in this part of the world. And it's apparently because of the yellow Earl Lauder, so I'm told, who was once a powerful landowner here. Mr. Whitelaw himself, of course, a pretty powerful landowner. Mr. Brown, apparently almost ready. The Liberal candidate on the right of your screen, and the Labour candidate, Lindsay William.
Here are the results of the poll for Penrith and the border. Whitelaw, William, Stephen, Ian.
Conservative.
29,304. Williams, Lindsay.
Labour.
6,612. Young, Michael Allen.
Liberal.
13,883. And I declare William Whitelaw duly elected.
So, as expected, 59% of the poll for Willie Whitelaw.
So there's Mr. Whitelaw's result in Cumbria, in Penrith. Good majority, very safe seat. Whether he's yet talked to the Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street about what the future holds for him, we don't know. He may, of course, already have been on the telephone to number 10. Well, it's now 12:25, just coming up to 12:26. We've got another 53 results to come in this general election of 1983. The state of the parties at the moment stands: Conservatives 369, Labour 204, the Liberal SDP alliance 20, and other parties on 4.
Well, for the Alliance, it's been a night of unfulfilled promise. Although they pushed up their share of the vote by 11 to 12%, excuse me, right the way across the region, that support wasn't translated into seats. The Alliance was defending 9 seats in Greater London, and it lost 7 of them. George Cunningham in Islington South, Neville Sanderson in Hayes and Harlington, Jim Wellbeloved in Erith and Crayford, and Bill Pitt in Croydon North West, all lost their seats to the Tories. The remaining 3, Brian McGee in Leighton, John Grant in Islington North, and Ron Brown in Hackney South and Shoreditch, were all ousted by Labour men. In the end, the Alliance could boast only 2 success stories. The first one was John Cartwright, who held on in Woolwich, a man who used to list among his recreations actually recruiting Labour Party members. You must be grateful he didn't do it too well. The other success story was Simon Hughes, whose famous by-election victory in Bermondsey just 15 weeks ago laid the foundation for another win at the polls. There was bitter Liberal disappointment at Chelmsford, where the former Tory Arts Minister, Norman St John Stevens, just managed to hold off their strong challenge, yet again a wafer-thin majority there of just 378. And it was the same story in Richmond, where Alan Watson failed by the narrowest of margins to snatch the seat from the Tory Jeremy Hanley. Alan Watson was asked for his reaction to the Alliance's uneven performance.
I think the main point I would like to make about that is that from what I have heard of the results nationally, and also in a real sense the result here, we are seeing not just the testing of the parties, we are seeing the testing of the system. And if the system awards a totally disproportionate number of seats to the Liberal Alliance throughout the country, then the system itself must now be put in question.
A very saddened Alan Watson at Richmond and Barnes. Well, at Leighton, the defeated SDP candidate Brian McGee was asked how is the SDP going to continue if it carries on losing seats the way it has been at this election?
Well, obviously it's going to be hard for us. I've always been a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist as regards the prospects for the SDP. I think the key to the situation is still, as it was from the beginning, what happens to the Labour Party. If the Labour Party goes down, and it seems to me absolutely downward bound and nothing can stop its decline now, nationally, then I think we must come out. It's inconceivable that the country could be a one-party government country for long.
Well, Simon Hughes, congratulations on your unique victory. How do you account for it?
I think that 2 things happened. The Labour Party was the same Labour Party with a different candidate, but the same policies as February. And people like liberalism. And after 40 years of Labour government in my borough, in my seat, increasingly unsatisfactory and increasingly removed, people have seen something that is young and refreshing, and they are very happy to stay with it. My number of votes went up.
Now, having seen the SDP results over the night, isn't it a bit of an embarrassment now for Liberals, your association with the SDP? Aren't they losers?
Well, the SDP, I think the last figures show they've won 4 seats. They had only ever won 2 in by-elections before. So they are, in fact, in terms of elections, going up, and their vote is, in many places, considerably up.
This isn't going to break the mould of British politics, though, is it?
As everybody said, that is the fault of an appalling system. We now have a Tory government with, as David Penhaligon said a little time ago, less votes than it got in '79, with an enormous majority. If Mrs Thatcher thinks she has that as a mandate to implement Tory policies, I sincerely hope the electorate will wreak a horrible revenge on her at the end of her term in office.
Isn't it an embarrassment for you that still the SDP and the Liberals can't quite get their act together? I mean, in a couple of places in London, in Hammersmith and in Hackney South, we see independent Liberals standing against the Alliance candidate. That's not good for the image, is it?
Out of 650 seats in the country, there were 3 places, as far as I know, where the 2 candidates stood against each other. For 2 parties to be prepared to work together and do everything else bar 3 seats in agreement is the first time in British politics. And what people are fed up with are parties fighting each other. constitutionally, the Liberal Party local associations have the right to choose candidates, as do the SDP.
Does it weigh on you that in this election what the Alliance may have done simply is just split the anti-Tory vote and let the Conservatives sail in with a landslide?
No, that too is the fault of the system. It doesn't weigh on me at all. If we can show people, and the cab driver who drove me here a moment ago was complaining, he actually lives in my constituency, was complaining at the anomaly of the seats and says it just cannot continue. If we can show the ridiculous, outdated nature of our system, then we have done a great service to British politics. The Labour Party is finished, and certainly the people of Southwark and Bermondsey have confirmed that.
Fine. Thank you, Simon Hughes. You've had 15 weeks. I hope you enjoy the next 5 years. And now I hand you back to David Dimbleby.
We've had the result in from Orkney and Shetland, Joe Grimmon's old seat. The seat he's held since 1950. The Liberals have held on to that seat. The Scottish nationalist, Winnie Ewing, got an increase in her share at the expense of the Liberals, but the Liberals still held it with a majority of 4,000. And from the seat of Caithness and Sutherland, the most northerly seat in Britain, an astonishing hold by the SDP, Mr McLennan there, who actually doubles his vote. The Conservative vote, the Labour vote right down, the SNP vote right down, and Robert McLennan in for that seat, which has had 5 different parties representing it since the war, with a majority of 6,800. It's just after 12:30. That's the state of the parties behind me. 370 Conservative, 205 Labour, 21 Alliance, 4 other. And I think, having had a lot of election news, perhaps it's time that we caught up with the rest of the news. So let's go to the newsroom and join Sandy Marshall.
Good afternoon. Mrs Thatcher is having a working lunch at number 10 this morning after her election triumph. Her first priority, to reshuffle her cabinet. She says it will continue to reflect a range of political views. I haven't been extreme for the last 4 years, and I'm not extreme now, she says. Mrs Thatcher, victorious from her Finchley constituency, returned to Downing Street at first light. A little over an hour ago, after some sleep, she left again for Conservative Party headquarters.
And now into the car, accompanied by her husband, Dennis. Some cheers from onlookers behind us. Mrs Parkinson.
She arrived there to pay the traditional vote of thanks to her party workers and watch the rest of the results come in.
Thatcher is here, close by me, just outside Mr Parkinson, as they're going in. Good morning, Mr Thatcher.
The Prime Minister intends to make up her mind about her new cabinet as soon as possible. She told Sir Robin Day she feels it's time for a new look.
What you have to do is that you've had a number of people in the House for quite a time. You've had a number of people in junior posts. You know, people who are climbing the ladder want to be able to climb up another rung. The terrifying thing and frightening thing for me, and it's the worst job I ever have to do here, is that means having to, if some people to come on the ladder, some people have to climb off. And it's not because they've done the job badly at all. It is because you have to keep movement in politics in order to keep people with something to go for.
I think it was Asquith who said, perhaps in this very building, that a Prime Minister must be a good butcher. Are you a good butcher, Mrs Thatcher?
No, I'm not a good butcher, but I've had to learn to carve the joint.
Michael Foot described the result as a tragedy for our country, and he strongly attacked the SDP for helping to give more seats to the Conservatives. But the Labour leader said he wouldn't disguise the scale of the defeat, nor his own part in Labour's poor showing.
Well, of course I've got to accept my responsibilities in the matter, and we will discuss the whole of the election, and I agree with those who said that the fight to win the next election starts immediately, and I will participate in those discussions, and of course I accept to the full my responsibilities in this election.
Mr Foot later returned to his London home. He emerged briefly to advise reporters not to hang around. He wouldn't be drawn on the subject of the party leadership. Earlier, he'd said he wouldn't make any prophecies. Mr Foot is expected to go to Labour's headquarters in South London this afternoon.
We wondered whether you were staying on as leader.
Most of those considered front-runners if Mr Foot does step down were saying very little on the subject. Deputy Leader Dennis Healey said Mr Foot had made it clear he wasn't going and no one was going to push him. And the man already made favourite by the bookmakers Roy Hattersley said it was a time of coming together for Labour and he would still be proud to serve under Mr Foot. But David Basnet, chairman of trade unions for a Labour victory, said he wanted the leadership issues settled sooner rather than later.
Oh, I think the sooner that can be done, the better.
Does that mean before the party conference?
Well, I think there'll have to be an election at the conference, and that is true. I think that's a matter for the party members themselves now to determine, and for Michael Foot to determine.
And would you expect to see Mr. Foot still leading the party in 12 months' time?
No, I wouldn't.
The Alliance were far short of their hope of coming second. They've got fewer than 24 MPs so far, although they received almost a quarter of the popular vote. Both Mr Steele and Roy Jenkins criticised the unfairness of the electoral system and called for it to be changed. Mr Jenkins was asked how that could be done.
We are going to exercise our power in the House of Commons, such it is, but we're going to exercise our power in the country because I believe that the British people fundamentally believe in a fair democratic system. And if the system produces a result which is a travesty of how they voted, that this will be seen as a scandal and the people will want to correct it.
Mr Steele, you've slept on it. What is your verdict on the election and the results as we know them so far?
Well, I still this morning feel a real sense of outrage at the vast number of votes we piled up with so little to show for it in the way of seats. I mean, to secure over a quarter of the electorate's support is a remarkable achievement, and I think we can be very satisfied with that. But I am very angry that we haven't got more seats out of it, and I do believe that such is the basic sense of fair play and justice in the electorate as a whole, that sense of outrage isn't going to be confined to the people who voted for us. I think a lot of people who voted Conservative or Labour will agree now that the electoral system ought to be changed.
Two of the original gang of four who launched the SDP lost their seats. Mrs Shirley Williams was beaten by the Conservative at Crosby, and Mr William Rogers lost to Labour at Stockton North. Labour's casualty list was studded with well-known names. The most sensational upset was in Bristol East, where left-winger Tony Benn was defeated after 33 years in the House of Commons by an unknown Tory, Jonathan Said. Left-winger Tony Benn was defeated after 33 years in the House of Commons by an unknown Tory, Jonathan Said. Former Labour Party chairman Joan Lester went too, beaten by the Conservatives at Slough. Former Social Services Secretary David Ennals lost his seat in Bradford North. Pat Wall, founder of Militant Tendency, was also defeated. The only Tory who failed to hang on to his seat was Junior Trade Minister Ian Sproat. In West Belfast, it looks like a landslide victory for Gerry Adams of the Provisional Sinn Féin. The MP since 1966, Gerry Fitt, has conceded defeat. It's certain there'll be a seat now at Westminster for the political wing of the IRA. Among early reactions abroad, the Falkland Islanders say they're delighted for Mrs Thatcher personally. In West Germany, Chancellor Kohl's Conservative Christian Democrat said it was a victory for NATO and the common market. EEC officials agree, although they fear a tougher line on Britain's rebate demands. Russia quotes Mr Foot as saying it's a tragedy. Now other news, and in Northern Ireland a soldier was killed this morning when a bomb exploded only moments before ballot papers were due to be counted in West Belfast. The IRA says it planted the bomb inside a lamppost and set it off as a joint police-army patrol was passing. Lance Price reports.
The dead soldier, a private in the Light Infantry Regiment, was killed instantly. A second soldier was treated in hospital for shock. The explosion blew the dead man across the road and smashed windows in nearby houses. And it followed an earlier unsuccessful attempt to kill a policeman in South Belfast by putting a bomb under his car. The fatal explosion happened 20 minutes before counting began in Northern Ireland, as local children were on their way to school. One boy, whose route would have taken him past the exact spot, said one of the two policemen in the patrol shouted a warning just before the bomb went off.
The building societies are to hold a special meeting in a fortnight to discuss the mortgage rate. Latest figures show there's not nearly enough money coming in to meet mortgage demand. Our economics correspondent says that unless the high street banks cut base rates, it seems certain the mortgage rate will go up on July the 1st. The building society's chairman, Mr Herbert Walden, said they couldn't decide on interest rates today because of the uncertainty in financial markets that always surrounds a general election. There's been a new approach for the auctioneer Sotheby's from an American property developer, Mr Alfred Taubman. Sotheby's directors have warmly welcomed the proposed bid. It has yet to go before the Monopolies Commission, which is already looking at another bid from two other American millionaires. In the Belgian city of Liège, about 100 gendarmes from a special police unit ran into heavy resistance when they tried to clear the streets of rubbish that had been accumulated during a strike by dustmen and other municipal workers. The gendarmes' street-sweeping march was halted when they were attacked from the flank by a horde of angry fire brigade workers also on strike. But the gendarmes had come prepared. They brought their own water cannon with them, and a battle royal developed. When the firemen exchanged their hoses for missiles, the police called it a day and beat a hasty retreat. The firemen made on concession to their municipal strike. They swept away the missiles that they'd thrown. That's all from us for now. Over to the weather now with Michael Fish.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Well, I don't think very many votes for the weather, certainly not in northern parts of the country before the day's out, because there's an unsettled patch on the way. In fact, the breeze is picking up already in western parts of Scotland. You have a fair amount of cloud. And although most of the afternoon will be dry, apart from the odd spot of rain and drizzle that is, come the evening I think you'll find some heavier and more persistent rain showing up in Northern Ireland and many western parts of Scotland. But the east staying dry and reasonably bright, probably until at least quite late in the day. In northern parts of England and the west of England and Wales, again, it's a pretty cloudy picture. Most places, I think, will be dry. There's just the outside chance of the odd spit of rain or drizzle in the wind, but fairly dry, and just every now and again, if you're well sheltered, reasonably bright as well. But the brightest of the weather, I think, will definitely be in the Midlands and southeastern parts of England. A fair amount of cloud, admittedly, but they're staying dry with some sunshine from time to time, and reasonable temperatures. 22 centigrade is 72 Fahrenheit. In some of these more northern and western parts, especially if you're near to the coast, though, you will notice it, if anything, decidedly chilly. During this evening and tonight, that rain will push on across Scotland, a fairly wet spell there, but later on in the night, drying up in western and northern parts, the rain then pushing into northwestern parts of England and Wales, but elsewhere, fine and dry. Well, that's all. Back to David Dimbleby in the election studio.
Back with the election, we have the results of Sir Ian Gilmore's vote at Chesham and Amersham. Here it is. Holds on nice safe seat in Buckinghamshire, Chiltern towns and villages and all the rest of it, and his share of the vote is 61%. So he's always all right there. And now we want to hear from the leader of the Scottish Liberal Party, Russell Johnson, who's just had a rather healthy increase in his majority too, and he's up there with Donny MacLeod.
In fact, a very healthy increase. I think, Russell, you've had 7 victories here in Inverness.
Yes.
This is the best one.
This is by far the best one. We've never had more than, what, 15,000? We've got 20,000. Highest majority was 5, and it's now 7 and a bit.
So many congratulations to you, but just as your result was being announced, came the news from Orkney and Shetland, came the news also from Caithness and Sutherland, and we're hanging on now for Ross and Cromarty. What's your reaction to these?
I'm very excited, I'm very pleased, I'm very proud that Liberals and Social Democrats in the Highlands have rallied and fought the way they have, and got the result they deserve, I think.
Well, talking about results they deserve, we've heard from the various leaders of the Liberals and the Alliance words like sham and outrage and anger and where is the fairness in the system. Do you think now there is going to be a major groundswell for some form of proportional representation?
Well, you probably heard the opinion poll that was conducted this morning, I think, in which 72% of the general public said that they would favour electoral reform, and only 16% the present system. Yes is the answer, but it will be up to us to maintain the pressure.
What about internally now? The Liberals are obviously going to be, by a long way, the majority in the Alliance. Is that going to affect the balance adversely?
I don't think so. I mean, quite obviously, we will all have to sit down and look at things afresh. There's 4 years to run. There's the whole question of who fights where, or indeed whether there is any sensible argument for sustaining 2 parties who clearly have such a wide area of agreement.
Well, many congratulations to you, and now the attention here in the north of Scotland switches to your neighbouring seat of Ross and Cromarty.
Thanks very much, Donny.
Now back to David Dimbleby in London.
We said there'd be a cabinet meeting on Thursday. Parliament, in fact, meets on Wednesday for the first time, when the Speaker will be sworn in. And the state opening of Parliament's on June the 22nd, which is a week later than that. Mrs Thatcher said about the forthcoming Parliament it's going to have a heavy programme. She said it would want to bring back some of the bills which fell in their last Parliament, including elements of the Finance Bill. It would want to introduce the government would, another trade union bill, a rates bill, and to reorganise local authorities in accordance with the pledge to abolish the metropolitan counties that was made, remember, during the campaign. We've had two more Conservative victories in, Reg Prentice, who used to be a Labour MP, and Edward Buchan. Here's Reg Prentice's result in Daventry, his vote down a little bit, and Edward Buchan, who was with us earlier, who caused a slight, well, not a storm exactly, but a slight furore by publishing that report on the economy in the middle of the campaign. Chairman of the 1922 Backbenchers Committee in the last Parliament, has to be re-elected this time round. He's safely back in his seat. Now we're going to, I think in a moment or two, get a result from Miss Lewin, where David Lomax is, for the result of Neil Kinnock's count there.
Well, here it is Loin. We're waiting for the result in the new constituency. We're waiting in the Civic Centre at Pontypridd. Mr. Brian Bird is the returning officer, and he's here with the candidates around the top table. Expecting the result in a few moments now. I don't suppose there's anybody here who has any doubt at all about the eventual result. It's a foregone conclusion because we're in the heart of safe, traditional Labour stronghold of the mining valleys in South Wales, that Mr. Neil Kinnock will safely hold this seat, but we'll know in a moment or two. It's apparently been a very high turnout. 78% is the turnout figure. Mr. Brian Bird, the returning officer, will be coming to make the declaration very soon now. Yes, Mr. Kinnock didn't arrive at the count until quite late. Of course, you probably realised has been on almost every radio, television programme there's been over the last few days. He's almost lost his voice when I talked to him earlier on. We've got 4 candidates in this constituency. There's a Conservative candidate, Mr. Michael Bevan. The SDP Liberal Alliance have Mr. David Johnson. There's Mr. Neil Kinnock himself, of course. He's there with his wife. I was talking earlier on to Mr. Kinnock. He was extremely coy, as you may have heard in that interview we did earlier on about the Labour leadership. To put it mildly. I think his wife has heard me making remarks like that and is finding it rather amusing to hear me say the word coy. I think that's a fair description of what he said. And here's Mr. Bird, the returning officer. He's just about to step on the platform now. He's ushering the candidates onto the platform. And in a few moments now, we expect the declaration in this new constituency of Islam. Here's Mr. Bird, the returning officer.
Parliamentary election, Islam constituency, date poll 9th June 1983. I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Bevan, Michael James,
Conservative,
5,511. Johnson, David Stanley,
SDP Liberal Alliance,
8,803. Kinnock, Neil Gordon,
Labour,
23,183. Richards and Iron, 1,574. That the under-mentioned person has been duly elected to serve as the member for the said constituency, Neil Gordon Kinnock.
So Neil Kinnock is back in Westminster as expected for Labour.
Mr. Returning Officer and ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all thank you all for the considerable patience that you've shown in putting up with our friends from the press and media this morning. I'm sure that they would want me to convey their thanks to you. It hasn't been difficult in cramped conditions, and I'm sure everybody accepts the contribution that you've made. I want to thank you, Mr. Returning Officer, Mr. Assistant Returning Officer, and your staff, both for what you did yesterday and for the way in which you've accomplished the count today. And in addition, I'd like to thank the police for their efficient service yesterday and the way in which they've benignly presided over our proceedings during the course of this morning and this afternoon. Most of all, for reasons that everyone will understand, I want to thank the members of the new Islwyn constituency Labour Party for the magnificent fight that they've made, covering the whole area, knocking on the doors, and ensuring that Islwyn remains as socialist, as Labour, as it has been, and that we show an example to the rest of the country. That example is necessary because yesterday's events were bad news for Britain and bad news especially for areas like Islwyn. In this area, we have had an increase of 2,600 in unemployment in 4 years. Our coal industry from this day is under direct threat as a consequence of the plans that we know of. Our steel industry will be subject to continual torture without the necessary investment required to assist those who are already trying to make a go of it. And worst of all, our services, we're unlikely to get the hospital that we need under this government, and our youth shall continue to be imprisoned without refuge for as long as we have mass unemployment policies. The message to go out from this constituency.
Well, Neil Kinnock at Islwyn at his result there, where his vote incidentally fell 15%. Held the seat, but his vote fell 15%. SDP vote went up 22% in Islwyn. One of the people who might certainly be a challenger for the leadership if the leadership of the Labour Party becomes vacant. Incidentally, we have figures on preferences of new Labour MPs in reply to our survey as who they'd like as their next leader. There's only been a slight shift, according to this, to the left in the new Parliamentary Labour Party. Support for Dennis Healey, people answering our questionnaires, falls from 40% to 25%. That for Tony Benn increases from 16 to 28, though he's not, of course, now an MP, and so wouldn't be in the running. And for Neil Kinnock, it increases from 12% to 21%. And the refusal to answer this question, not surprisingly, is described as very high. So we shouldn't perhaps put too much credence on those figures. Maybe Sir Robin will get something out of one of his guests now. Let's go over to that table there, Robin.
Yes, and I have with me Peter Shaw, who, of course, is another possible leader of the Labour Party. And we have Jim Pryor, who is back from his victory, joining us, and also up in Manchester, Mr. Cyril Smith again. Good morning, Cyril, again. I want to start with this Labour Party question, because we heard David Basnett saying on the news that he didn't expect Mr. Foot to be leader in 12 months' time. Do you agree, Peter Shaw?
Well, I have yet, of course, to hear what Michael's own reflections are on the election result. But if you were to ask me as a straight, plain probability, I think probably David Basnett is right. I think that Michael, who knows very well, he carries the very strong affection of the party and its respect. He needn't worry about his personal position, but I think his judgment about the party and its need to prepare for the period that lies ahead will prompt him to that conclusion.
What would you advise him?
Well, I would like to talk to him first before I gave him advice. I'd like to know what he himself is thinking.
And if he goes within the next few months, will you be a candidate?
I'll talk to my friends, but I wouldn't, I'm certainly not going to deny that I would.
Because you used to be his favourite for the leadership, didn't you? Until that fateful weekend when everyone persuaded him to stand.
Well,
You ought to say to me for years, Peter Shaw's the man, Peter Shaw's the man.
Well, we have been old friends and close colleagues for a long time, and that remains.
Jim Pryor, what do you think about this election result? And in particular, I don't know whether you heard it, but if you didn't, I'll tell you, the Prime Minister, in a short interview she was kind enough to
give us, earlier this morning she said she saw government as a matter of trust and that she was going to keep a broad spectrum of conservative opinion in her government. I'm paraphrasing her words. That's certainly what Norman St. John Stevens' interpretation of it. He thought it was a very important statement. What do you think about it? And the landslide, the size of the majority?
Well, I've always thought the Prime Minister would be like this, and I've no doubt she will keep a broad spectrum in her cabinet and in her government, and we are a coalition of interests, and it's very important that she should.
Hold on just a moment, Jim, because we're going to Downing Street to see the Prime Minister leaving Tory headquarters, I think.
Here comes the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, tell us about your one bad moment last night. Prime Minister leaves Central Office, where she's being applauded by all her staff, Dennis Thatch on the other side. And she's going back to Downing Street now for a luncheon with Cecil Parkinson and the Chief Whip, Michael Joplin, and perhaps a few others. And I'm reliably assured that they will begin the process of cabinet building. Now, there's one thing I must tell you about the speech she gave inside to her party workers. This was a party she gave in private to all the people, including all the volunteers. And the thing we're told that she said was this, that last night she had one bad moment when they lost Yeovil. But it was soon past because then they gained Nuneaton. And from then on, of course, it was plain sailing. The other detail about what happened inside was that they also gave her a very big cake. Since that time, she's been upstairs in her office here, watching results like Willie Whitelaw's in Penrith, and also getting on the telephone to other members of the party to congratulate them, and who knows, perhaps to sound them for the preparations she's going to make for the cabinet. Well, that's about it. Life is back to business as usual here. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, the press are the press. We're inside the barriers. We're not allowed inside Central Office. For them, the election is over. And now, from us in Smith Square, where there was a crowd, a small crowd there, compared to Downing Street, to Clapper as she left to go back, it's now back to David Dimbleby in the studio.
And I think we might pick up where we were with Sir Robin's interview when we went away to see Conservative headquarters of Mrs. Thatcher there. Robin.
Thank you. We'll may go back to Downing Street to see Mrs. Thatcher arrive there. But you were saying, Jim Pryor, about Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister and your confidence that she would have a broad-based Conservative government.
Yes, and I think it's even more important. The bigger the majority, the more important it is to have a broadly based government.
Why do you say that?
Well, because it's much harder to keep a party together in Parliament when you've got a very big majority, as we found in
That's what Francis Pym was worried about.
Well, I mean, Francis or Chief Whip, thank goodness, I've never been in the Whip's office in my life and never liked it to get there. But the fact of the matter is that I remember the '59 Parliament very well, and Jerome Barrow was always leading revolts against the government in 1959. And I do think unless your party is very broadly represented in government, it's very much harder to keep it together.
What you're saying is that unless she has a fair representation of people in the cabinet who hold your kind of views, that there's going to be trouble on the backbenches.
No, I'm not saying that. No. You're putting words in my mouth now that I certainly haven't said, but I think she's going to be wise over this. I'm really following what she has said, and I think she's been a good party manager. She kept the last party together very well in the House of Commons in the last Parliament, and I think she'll be going to do the same thing this time. And what is more, when you have a very big majority like this, as she said herself, she's won a great victory, and I think she's going to try and unite as many people as she can behind it.
Are you one of those Conservatives who regard themselves as on the liberal wing of the Tory party, small l, who also believe in electoral change or electoral reform?
Well, I've always believed that we needed to have much more stability in government, and one has seen in the past 20 years this violent swing from one side of the political spectrum to the other. And I felt that there was something to be said for a modified form of proportional representation. And in fact, I have voted on this in the House of Commons from time to time. I'm now glad to say that we're going to have a stable government pursuing the same policies for a number of years.
Hold on, we're just going to Downing Street, Jim, so excuse me, because it is your great leader.
And the Prime Minister returns to Downing Street, still smiling. rather sooner than we'd thought, and as Fred Emery was saying, she will be lunching here in Downing Street, in fact, with Cecil Parkinson and the Chief Whip, Michael Jopling. A busy afternoon, but now some light entertainment, as, followed by a mass of cables, we join the Prime Minister as she meets the public in Downing Street. Mrs. Thatcher getting an enthusiastic welcome. It is fair to say that most of the people who've waited patiently are keen supporters of her.
Congratulations. Marvellous job, Prime Minister. Keep going. That's marvellous. That's particular. Swindon. Do give her my warm regards. And of course, we're helping. We'll give Margaret my warm regards. Congratulations, Mrs. Thatcher. Thank you very much.
I'll still shake your hand.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've done really well.
Thank you very much. That's the spirit. Yes. Welcome. You're here on holiday, are you? Good morning. Good morning.
Many smiling faces, many people who've waited a long time before they were allowed into Downing Street a short time ago. Mrs. Thatcher clearly enjoying herself, and I think this is where our cables run out. Let's see if we can speak to some of the people who Mrs. Thatcher has greeted.
Right up and have a look at it before you
We're having a slight difficulty here. Our cables have run out. If we have a longer piece of string, we could go further with her. If I can get my cameraman back, we'll talk to some of the people who've been greeting her. Hello, how long have you been waiting?
About an hour.
Are you a supporter of Mrs. Thatcher?
No.
No, you're not? So why did you wait so long?
Never. I wanted to see her.
So what's your reaction at the outcome of the election? Sorry? Not so happy. What about you, sir? How long have you been waiting?
About the same, about an hour.
And are you a supporter of hers?
No, I'm afraid not.
Oh dear, well, we better see if we can find... I think you're a supporter of hers, aren't you, madam?
Yes, from Peterborough.
Did you come down from Peterborough this morning?
Yes, this morning, yes.
So what's your feeling about the outcome of the election?
I think it's marvellous, wonderful. She's a marvellous woman.
You were smiling, I think, weren't you?
Yes. I'm on holiday. I'm on holiday here from Darlington, County Durham.
Have you been waiting long
Yes,
out on
2
White?
hours. 2 hours we've waited to see her come back. We missed her going out, so we've been standing 2 hours. Yeah, well, I saw her going, yes. Yes, you saw her practically 2 hours. It was on holiday.
Just trying to see where Mrs. Thatcher is now. She's well down Downing Street, shaking a lot of hands, and obviously enjoying herself very much indeed. Now, from Downing Street, back to the studio.
There's, just before we go back to Sir Robin, which I think we will in a moment, one interesting thing coming up on the computer, which is we're keeping an eye all the time on the number of votes cast for the Liberals, as well as just for the SDP Liberal Alliance. And if you look just at the Liberal vote, it's very nearly equal to the Labour vote in constituencies where Liberal and Labour are together. It's running at 27.4% and the Labour vote at 28.5%, so they're almost neck and neck. Go back again just for a moment to Downing Street, I think. Mrs. Thatcher on her way back, past supporters and non-supporters.
Mrs. Thatcher now walking briskly. I think you can see the problem that we had with the cables a moment ago. Mrs. Thatcher waving and smiling as she makes her way into Downing Street. This, I think, the last view that we will have of her today. She is now off for lunch with Michael Parkinson and her Chief Whip, and, as Fred Emery was saying, to begin the process of reshaping her cabinet for this new government which she now forms. A final wave from the step of Downing Street, and there's always one more wave for the photographers, and away. And now back to David Dimbleby.
Michael Parkinson's a new appointment. Hadn't heard of that. It's Cecil Parkinson. Television's not all it's made out to be. And you may have just caught a glimpse, incidentally, of Mark Thatcher. Mark Thatcher had been rather hidden away during the campaign, but he was there giving his father a great bear hug on the pavement just at the beginning before Mrs. Thatcher crossed over. Well, now, let's pick up the discussion that Sir Robin was having a moment ago. Robin.
Yes, and we're joined by Cyril Smith in Manchester and Neil Kinnock. I'm not sure where he is, but I'll bring him in just a moment. But I just want Jim Pryor to continue what he was saying, which was most interesting on the subject of electoral reform. You were about to indicate some sympathy with some form of electoral reform, were you not?
Yes, I certainly don't believe it can be just a list system or anything like that, but I do think there is something to be said. Certainly we ought to not dismiss it out of hand, the idea of the German system. But I don't know whether this is going to get off the ground or not, and I suspect that it won't. All I can say is that in the days gone by, when we were getting these violent swings between one government and another government, I felt from the point of view of industry that it was something that ought to be examined rather more closely.
What do you think of that, Cyril Smith?
Well, I find it very encouraging, but in fact not surprising, coming from Jim Pryor, who I've had the pleasure of working with when he was Minister for Employment and whose views I had a great respect for.
And what do you think now of the result as a whole? Cyril, we talked last night before there was much coming in. You've had a chance to think about it, your alliance, your party. What about it?
Well, I think the result is a damn disgrace in terms of democracy. I mean, here we are with 7 million votes and 20 seats. The Labour Party with less than 1 million votes more than we have, with almost 200 seats. I don't believe you can talk about a democracy in that situation. We have a Tory government which has had a landslide with I don't know how many more seats than last time, with actually less votes than it polled in 1979. I mean, where the devil are we going? This is not democracy. It might be freedom, but it certainly isn't democracy.
Hold on for a moment, Cyril. Peter Shaw, where the devil are we going? Can you call that democracy?
Well, what Cyril Smith is commenting upon is the appalling results of the intervention of a new force, the Social Democrats, who broke away from the Labour Party and who have indeed won a great number of votes but haven't won any seats. There's nothing changed in the situation other than the defection of a number of voters from the Labour Party to the Alliance. And he is complaining of the fact that they haven't actually got sufficient votes in order to win a large number of seats.
Cyril?
I'm complaining that we... first of all, let me make it absolutely clear to Peter, with great respect, who's another man that I respect, but let it be absolutely clear that we have a right to contest elections. I mean, good God, you listen to these Labour leaders and these Tory leaders, and you'd think we've no right to be on the scene at all. I mean, it's quite disgraceful that a third party should interrupt the two-party system in this country. We've a perfect right to stand. We've polled 7 million. We're entitled to representation, and we've been denied it. And we've been denied it by a rotten, corrupt system that doesn't apply to any other free country in Europe.
Peter Shaw?
Well, I think that this is the language of extravagance and the language of defeat. But to refer to the first-past-the-post system on the single-member constituencies of Britain as a rotten and corrupt system it does no benefit whatsoever to democracy in this country.
Well, I want to go on and bring in Neil Kinnock, if I may. Where are you, Neil?
I'm in the council offices of Islwyn Borough Council, and behind me is a great display demonstrating the considerable advantages of bringing your industry to this borough.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that little commercial, and we don't begrudge it to you for one moment.
We're going to need it.
Let me just read to you what Tribune says today, your friends on the left wing of the Labour Party. Tribune says, and listen carefully, it goes without saying that this election has been a disaster for Labour. First, Labour must never again go into an election with leaders, most of whom are so manifestly out of sympathy with the programme on which they're supposed to be campaigning. Every effort should be made to get Tony Benn back into Parliament as soon as possible. The fact is that Labour's policies, notably those on the bomb, were hardly put to the electorate. Neil Kinnock?
I don't believe that's strictly accurate. Indeed, the continual debates about the bomb provided us with some opportunities to get the full policy across. Unfortunately, because of the impediments of a press that either couldn't or wouldn't listen to the accurate versions of the policy, we had some difficulty in doing that. But we did have the policy of non-nuclear strategy to be accomplished in the lifetime of the Parliament. It did mean strengthening our conventional forces, and it did mean
David Penhaligon,
ending
a
the
greatly
vanity
increased majority of nearly 3,000, and in your
trying
victory
to pretend
speech,
that we can play
you
with the big
expressed the
boys,
same sense of
and
outrage
it did
felt by
mean
David
avoiding
Steele
the
at the fact
costs
that the party
and
has
the
got so many
risks
votes
of maintaining
and so
nuclear
few
status.
seats. You
It
talked about
didn't come
a
across
parliament
as
that
clear
is...
as it should, but it wasn't the thing that lost us the election, and there were many of us making a direct effort to ensure it was clear.
Can I ask you to comment on Mr. David Basnett's remark reported on our midday news, which was that he did not expect Mr. Michael Foot to be leader of the Labour Party in 12 months' time. Would you agree with that?
I think that's Michael's decision. I think we had this discussion in the early hours of this morning, and nothing has changed since, except that there is an even wider consensus reported everywhere that any number of people, when offered that question, are giving exactly the same answer as
Let me come to Mr. Pryor again. Mr. Pryor, do you think this is a watershed in British political history? Do you think it's a new era, a new situation, a new scene?
I think it's very difficult to tell. I certainly think that the Labour Party will have to change a great deal, and to that extent, perhaps it could be a watershed. I mean, I'm still absolutely certain in my own mind that the Labour Party is fighting many of the battles of 40 or 50 years ago, and I think there will have to be major changes there. But whether or not it will mean that the Labour Party is going to put itself together, and as it did between 1959 and 1964, at that time I think people were rather prematurely writing the Labour Party off, but whether or not it pulls itself together this time will be a matter of how it is led in Parliament.
May I just ask on a totally different matter, what is your comment on the result in Belfast West? I don't think we've actually had the result, but we heard earlier, I think before you... We've had the result, and I wonder if we could be reminded of it. I wonder if we could be reminded of the result in West Belfast. It was the Sinn Féin candidate was elected.
It was actually a concession, I think. It was a concession
well,
by
I was
thinking,
thinking,
that he was going to be defeated.
Yes, but Mike, the experts up top were saying that we'd had the result. Is that correct or not? It's not correct. David Dimbleby is right, which I thought was the position. Gerry Fitt has somehow conceded the defeat, his own defeat. What do you say about that and the Sinn Féin victory, if there is one, and about Gerry Fitt generally?
Well, I'm glad you asked me this, because I have to go in just a minute. I think that the important thing to look at will be the figures to see how many votes were cast for constitutional government and against violence. And we can't, so that's the important thing. I don't think it's a great surprise to any of us that neither Gerry Fitt nor Joe Hendren are winning the seat. All I can say is that I believe that in losing Gerry Fitt from the House of Commons, the House of Commons has lost one of the most courageous and honourable men that have been there this century. And I'm very sorry to see him go. And I admire enormously the courageous stand that he's taken over the years. Now, I don't suppose amongst his own supporters that will help him a great deal. But I hope he will realise that people this side of the water have an enormously high respect for all that he stood for in the last few years.
You would not disagree, would you, Peter Shaw?
Not at all. I think that nobody really over here, other than those who've been very closely connected with Irish, Northern Ireland affairs, really understands the sheer pressure and intimidation and threat through which he has lived for so long. He's a man of the utmost courage and integrity.
Thank you very much, Peter Shaw, Jim Pryor, Cyril Smith and Neil Kinnock. David?
Thank you, Robin. Shirley Williams is with Richard Lindley after her defeat at Crosby. I gather that he talked to her earlier on. So let's just hear from her, talking about her future, what she's going to do. Remember, this is the second general election running that she's lost.
You said last night in Crosby that the SDP is a force that will never, never die. Now, I'm sure you still believe that this morning.
Oh, indeed I do.
Don't you, as president of the party, owe it to them to promise now that you will stand again at the first opportunity?
I don't think so. I think it's very much a question of who the most suitable candidate is. I think I owe it to them to promise that I will continue to work for the victory of the party, but there are more ways than merely by standing for by-elections to do so. And I think it's very much a question of horses for courses.
The Norman St. John Stevens, who just got back himself last night, said this morning that he was personally sorry, even though he is a Conservative, of course, that you had not. That's not the first time he's felt sorry for you. I think many people of all parties will feel sorry you're not in Parliament.
Oh, I think they needn't bother. I mean, it's very sweet of them and I appreciate it, but frankly, there are many, many ways, I think, to assist in the political process in this country. And one of the things I want to spend some time on is the whole question about how we could deal with unemployment. I'm perfectly sure the government is quite wrong in saying that nothing can effectively be done about it. And I don't have to be a member of Parliament to do that. Indeed, in some ways, being a member of Parliament where the government has such a vast majority may not always be the most effective way to advance the thing one believes in. And I think perhaps if I can serve as somebody who's working on and trying to show ways in which we can deal particularly with youth unemployment, that may be as useful thing as I would do by being in Parliament sitting on the benches occasionally trying to get myself into a debate. I do appreciate what Norman said. He and I seem to have a kind of tweedledum tweedledee relationship. I remember he was extremely nice when I lost Stevenage, and I was equally distressed when he left the cabinet, so maybe that'll be our future. Perhaps we're going in and out like the weathermen.
It sounds to me as if we shouldn't expect to see you trying to get back to Parliament soon.
Not in the immediate future, no.
That was Shirley Williams talking to Richard Lindley earlier today. The result you just saw, Leon Britton from Richmond, Yorkshire, a new seat that he went to, or at least not a new seat, but a seat that he was new to, and which he won. There was no surprise there, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Now, we've got one Scottish result. There's an interesting thing being happening in Scotland, which is that the Scottish Nationalists, who didn't do very well in 1979, the party that's devoted to independence for Scotland, the use of Scottish oil and all that, didn't do very well in 79, were hoping to pick up a bit at this election, don't appear to have done so well. And here is one of their really quite bad results that's just come in from Tayside North, Conservative marginal seat, majority of 10,000, and the SNP vote is down 17% there. And the Conservative increases his majority fivefold in Tayside North as a result of the confusion of the other parties. Now, that's just one result from Scotland, but Peter has been looking at the pattern in Scotland as a whole. Peter.
Well, in this election, which is going really all the Tories' way, the Scots are showing us that they like to do things a bit differently. In Scotland, there's that Tayside North result we've just had, where the Tories have taken that huge slab of country in the Highlands there. In Scotland, two things are happening that are not happening elsewhere. First of all, Labour are doing really better there than they're doing anywhere else. And secondly, the Alliance are doing better there than they're doing anywhere else. What we have in Scotland is a picture of the Labour Party reasserting, in a sense, its dominance of that central belt there. Just look how Strathclyde, the Glasgow area, has gone completely red. Even Glasgow Cathcart, the old Tory seat there, has turned red. Up in the north here, we have the Alliance taking Caithness, taking, as we had, Inverness, and taking that new seat of Gordon there, and the two old seats that David Steele had, one seat there, Roxburgh and Selkirk, is now two seats the Alliance have taken there. So the Liberal SDP Alliance are moving ahead in Scotland. There's the change in Scotland, with the Alliance forging ahead. That's their best performance in the whole country. The SNP down, they're sinking back. That October 74, 30% they had has now dropped right down. The SNP are sinking, but the Alliance are through. And look at that change there between Labour and Conservative. Only a very small movement to the Conservatives in Scotland. And finally, the gains in Scotland, just emphasising that point. There's the Alliance success. There's Gordon in the north-east of Scotland, that new seat in East Aberdeenshire there. And here is the seat of Roxburgh and Berwickshire, that other part of David Steele's seat that's been taken. And down here you see two Tory gains at Cunningham North and Renfrew West. Renfrew West, this seat here, is a seat really that the Tories took because it was really a fight between the SDP and Labour, and the Tories came through in the middle. And finally Labour consolidating their hold on the central urban heartland of Scotland there with that win in Glasgow Cathcart. So Scotland, a rather different picture to the rest of the country.
Well, there's been a lot of talk already today about the attitude of the trade unions to Labour's defeat, what they'll do, having stepped in before to try and get the Labour Party sorted out for that election, having seen this disaster yesterday. What are they going to do now? And Vincent Hanna at Labour headquarters in Walworth Road has with him two trade unionists to carry on that discussion. Vincent.
Thank you, David. Two prominent trade unionists, Ken Cameron, already on the General Council of the TUC, Roy Grantham, about to go on the General Council of the TUC under the new system. Will there be a new leader of the Labour Party soon?
Oh yes, I think so. We need to go into the next election with a leader in 1988
who has won by-elections and has been party to forming new policy which will win the country for the Labour Party.
New policy?
New policy.
You want to see new policies?
We need new policies. We had quite a number of policies, but we were not able to put over to the people a conviction that we could effectively carry them out. We've got to do that in the future.
Any other changes have to be made?
I think we have to have an election of the leader by a vote of all the party, and I think we have to have MPs elected locally by votes of all their local Labour Party members, selected candidates, so that we have a more democratic posture in the minds of the people.
Ken Cameron, you're on the left of the TUC General Council. First, two separate points. First of all, constitutional change, new policies. I don't expect you to agree with that.
Well, as far as the policies are concerned, I believe that the policies were absolutely correct. Unfortunately, they didn't come across. At times we had leading members of the party who were making statements, for example, Jim Callaghan's statement on disarmament, which were not helpful and divisive. I don't think we got the unilateral argument across to the people. With regard to constitutional change, I think we've made the constitutional changes. I hope we don't get into another constitutional wrangle that the public won't understand.
Now, a question of leadership. Do you agree with Roy Grantham on that point?
On the question of leadership, I think on age grounds alone, not with regard to how he conducted the campaign, but on age grounds alone, I think that Michael will go of his own volition. That will happen reasonably quickly, and hopefully that we can then get the leadership contest over and get ready for fighting the next election.
In the autumn you expect the contest then?
I would hope so, and the way the party works, it would have to be very quickly in order that we could get nominations out in July.
Now, let's be clear, who are you saying are the contenders, eliminating all the possibilities and coming down to the final few?
Well, the contenders, as I understand, would be Shore, Hattersley and Kinnock.
That's all, not Healy?
Well, I think Healy is now at his age, 67.
He's a member of your union, Roy Grantham. Do you exclude him too?
Oh, I do indeed. I think those are the three contenders. We need somebody young and capable in 1988.
Right, now tell me, who do you think will be the next leader of the Labour Party?
Well, I think we need, first of all, a different type of leadership to that which Mrs Thatcher exercises. We need a more collective leadership in the party, so I don't see the leader as standing isolated from everybody else. But secondly, of course, we do need a leader. I think Neil is too young. I think the other two are very capable indeed. A week ago I would have said it was going to be Peter Shaw. Roy Hattersley has done very well this last week. I think it's level pegging for those two.
What's your judgment on that, Ken Cameron?
Well, I think that it's going to be a very interesting contest, but I would put my money on Neil Kinnock.
As against?
As against the other two. And I think...
Do you agree that Hattersley would have the edge on Shore, or that Shore would have the edge on Hattersley, as far as the centre or the centre-right was concerned?
Well, as far as the centre-right's concerned, it's a matter for the centre-right, but I would I would imagine that Peter Shore would be favourite of the two.
Really? Now, why are you backing, or appear to be, inclining towards Roy Hattersley?
No, I said a week ago I would have supported Peter, and I still think he's a very capable candidate. Roy has done very well in the last week, and I think that we must all talk together, because we do not want a row in the party. We've got to have a proper selection which unites the party.
It's a well-known fact that you do,
good leader.
It's a well-known fact that you do talk to other unions, particularly certain unions of certain political persuasions. Now, from your intelligence and from your conversations around, where do you think the unions are going to put their support?
I don't know. I haven't talked to them.
Where's
I think that's got to be done. I
can't believe you haven't discussed it.
I am sure it is between Shore and Hattersley. I still think Shaw has the edge in seniority and standing, but we'll have to talk enough to find out.
One last final word.
Well, a significant thing in the leadership contest was the defeat of Tony Benn in Bristol. Obviously, that has an effect on the leadership contest. It puts Tony out of the arena. And I would imagine that the candidate on the left, if you like, or the centre-left, or whatever you want to call it, would be Neil.
Neil Kinnock. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Very interesting new aspect of politics in the unions now, and the contest goes on. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Vincent. The first result from Northern Ireland shows an increase in the official unionist vote over the Democratic Unionists, that's Ian Paisley's Unionists, and an increase in Sinn Féin over SDLP. Here's the result from Belfast North. The official Union is taking it with a majority of 7,000. His vote up about 6%, Democratic down 5%, Sinn Féin in fourth place, but its vote up 12%, and the SDLP down 4.5%. When I say up 12%, it wasn't standing before. It gets 12.8% of the total poll of Sinn Féin in that seat. Well, now, at 25 past 1, Mrs Thatcher is at number 10 Downing Street with the Chief Whip, Michael Jopling, with the Chairman of the party, Cecil Parkinson, no doubt discussing what she's going to do with her cabinet, perhaps, or looking back over the results. Cecil Parkinson himself, of course, one of those who may be in line for some more senior position, perhaps the most likely of all of them. We've still got 22 results to come in, the bulk of them from Northern Ireland, some interesting ones, including Enoch Powell's, still to come through, and we'll be keeping an eye on those. But in the meantime, this is the state of the parties, with 22 results to come. Conservatives 394, Labour 208, the Alliance 21, others 5.
And with all the votes now in for Greater London, let's take a look at the state of the parties here. And we can see the Conservatives have 56 seats, that's up 8. Labour on 26, down 1. The Alliance on 2, and they've lost 7 seats. And this is the individual parties' share of the vote. The Conservatives on 44%, Labour on 30%, the Alliance pushing them into a close third on 25%. The one seat which was widely regarded as a barometer of the way that London was going to vote was Ealing North. Former teacher Harry Greenway took it for the Tories, beating Tony Benn's son Hillary with a majority of over 6,000. Edmonton, that's Labour's strongest seat in Enfield, also fell to the Tories. The sitting MP, Ted Graham, a former government whip and shadow minister for the environment, was ousted by the Tory Ian Twin, a lecturer in town planning. Feltham and Heston, that's Heathrow Airport part of the world, which was way down on Labour's marginal list at about number 41, was a Tory target. The barrister Patrick Ground dislodged Russell Kerr, who'd been an MP for the area for 17 years. In Lewisham East, another sitting MP, Roland Moyle, Labour man and opposition spokesman for foreign affairs, went down to the Tories' Colin Moynihan, a young marketing manager. Perhaps the most galling of the Alliance defeats was Croydon North West, which was, of course, won by Bill Pitt in 1981 at the really high watermark of the Alliance. This time he went down to the Tories' Humphrey Mallins, who had a majority of just over 4,000. In Hayes and Harlington, Neville Sanderson suffered a similar fate. He lost to Terry Dix, a Hillingborough councillor. In Islington South, George Cunningham, the SDP spokesman on education and science, lost to Labour's Christopher Smith by 363 votes. Now, Richmond and Barnes was a real nail-biter for the Liberals. Here we can see it resulted in the closest finish in the entire region. A majority of just 74 for Jeremy Hanley over the Liberals' Alan Watson, of course a former television presenter. And then going to the Southwark and Bermondsey result there, we can see Simon Hughes, a famous victory for him, 17,000 votes, a majority of over 5,000. The only remaining Labour seat now in the southeast, outside of London, is Una MacDonald's Thurrock, which she held with a majority of 1,772. Well, let's take a look at the vote in the southeast now. And there's the share. The Conservatives on 54%, the Alliance on 28%, Labour on 17%, and let's see how that's changed on 79 figures. And we can see that the Alliance have taken practically all their votes, 12%, from Labour. Well, that's the situation in the southeast. With me is Professor Ivor Crewe. Ivor Crewe, can you tell me, do you think the Tories have done as well as they ought to have done, judging by the opinion polls that we had earlier?
Well, they haven't done quite as well as the opinion polls were suggesting. I mean, nationally, the opinion polls were all suggesting that they'd be at about 46%, and that hasn't happened. They're probably going to get about 43%. In fact, the opinion polls have not done all that well at this general election. I think they'll be looking at their methods once again.
How significant do you think the performance of the SDP has been? They haven't really achieved liftoff, have they, this time round?
Well, how do you assess significance? I mean, in one sense, the Alliance can claim that they've done very well indeed. They've got their highest share of the vote for a centre party since 1923. Well, that's a pretty good record. They are also doing a great deal better than centre parties abroad are doing. So in a sense, they've really piled up a lot of votes. But of course, it hasn't been translated into seats. I think they will be disappointed. I think that they probably wanted something like at least 40 seats in the House of Commons in order to claim a significant presence there, and they clearly aren't going to get
Do you think that their poor performance is going to put a strain on the Alliance?
I think it could easily put a strain on the alliance because, of course, there's always been a wing of the Liberal Party which has said that the Liberals will be better off without the SDP, that the SDP is a drag. And indeed, there has been some evidence that the connection with the SDP did in fact mean that some people didn't vote
Ivor
for
Crewe,
it.
I think, thank you very much. We'll take a quick look at one of the most sensational results in the South East overnight, and that was Slough, where Joan Lester lost her seat after 17 years. And there we see the Tories gaining a majority of 3,100. So she doesn't think it was anything to do with her left-wing views, but there she's lost, she's out of Parliament. Now I hand you back to David Dimbleby.